This is a perennial digression, an extended experiment in imposing my thinly undiagnosed ADHD on others. My name is David Armstrong, but more importantly, I'm joined once again today by Addison Hodges Hart, retired professor, Anglican priest, and most excellent author of several works, including a forthcoming volume on ghost stories. Addison, thanks so much for agreeing to do this again. It's a generous use of your time, and it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, David. Correction, I was never a professor, although I taught college courses in the past. So I've never actually had the title professor. You can call me professor if you choose. I'm open to that. No, but thank you for the compliment.
Yeah, of course. Well, you've got the professorial spirit. You might enjoy when I took Greek and Latin at Missouri State. My Greek professor had us call him Despota. So he would walk in every day and be like, "Kaire te omatheitai," and we would say, "Kaire despota." So I make my Latin students call me Imperator or Magister Amipotens.
So. No exaggerated ego problems here. Exactly.
No, of course. I have one of them whisper "Memento Mori" in my ear, while I teach.
That's
yeah. So
keep you real.
Right. Yes. That's actually a good segue. So the conversation I pitched to you today was on generalized spookiness, especially on ghosts and ghost stories, which I know are near and dear to your heart. But I wanted to start by asking you about your novel Confessions of the Antichrist, which was relatively recently republished by Angelica Press. Do I have that right?
Yeah. There's the book right there.
Yes.
Yes, it was published. I'm guessing it was about a year ago now. Would have to be about a year. So do you have any specific questions about it? Have you read it? That's the first question. If you haven't, feel free to confess this.
Yeah, so I haven't finished it yet, I confess. My life for the last 2 months has just been spent getting ready for my long-term sub. But I have read bits and pieces of it, and I guess my general question is, what possessed you to write about the Antichrist when you composed the novel, and what inspired the new edition of it? Because if I understand, there was something like a 10-year gap maybe between republication.
Yeah, there was actually the original edition was I just had put it up on Kindle is all I did.
Oh, okay. Because
David, my brother, who you've interviewed now a couple of times and I've gotten to know fairly well, he actually urged me to go ahead and actually urged me to do it. I didn't have any intention of even pursuing publishing it at all, and then he got me to do it, and I was quickly dissatisfied with the version that was up and took it down, or maybe within a couple months or so of putting it up. Not that I thought it was bad, but just that it could be much improved, which is what I did. And then I just put it aside. I worked on so many other things in the interval. And then finally last year, or actually about a year before that, I again, at the urging of my brother, went ahead and pushed it in the direction of Angelica Press and John Reese, the managing editor there. And to my surprise, got an immediate yes on it, and it came out about a year ago. So, and it's been selling fairly well. I mean, I'm not a bestseller by a long shot, but there it is, and the people who've read it all seem to have enjoyed it. Except of the reviews I got one review from a very traditionalist Catholic site, which was not positive, and which I put on my Facebook page because it tickled me so much. Just the very people I went after to annoy were annoyed. So it's
yeah. Making trads angry is sort of like a badge of honor. I mean, it's one of the lower honors I feel like you can get in the field because it's so easy to do, but it's an important like thing to get.
Well, by far my favorite review of the book, of all the ones I got.
Yeah, there you go. So it's interesting how the figure of the Antichrist sort of takes on a spooky aura in contemporary Western media, especially in New Testament literature and in the Apocalypse. He's sort of clearly like Antiochus IV Epiphanes meets Nero Caesar, right?
Yeah,
he's an archetype, basically. He's the ultimate pagan emperor and oppressor. And it's a set of images that in their original settings, they're so public that the like occultism of our literary antichrists, I'm thinking of yours, but I'm also thinking of Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman's in Good Omens, which is probably my favorite literary antichrist, can be kind of jarring. It feels to some extent like the antichristic craze that was popular when I was younger is maybe no longer as active, but also maybe I just don't hang out with evangelicals as often these days. What genuine fear stands behind the literary image of the Antichrist, as far as you can tell, for most contemporary Christians? And what does it like? Does it hold any for you, I guess?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't hold any fear for me. And let me explain why. Actually, in the novel, I actually put out all of these theories about the Antichrist. And the first thing to say about my novel, let me just sidetrack onto that. It's meant to be a combination of satire. So there's a I hope you notice the humor here. And if you haven't gotten to the last chapter, that may be the funniest chapter in the book. At least I thought it was funny, but I've got and then there was an interaction between the Antichrist figure and a Dominican father in one scene, where I got in a lot of offhand Groucho Marx style jokes. So so it's meant to be both funny and serious at the same time. The whole thing is actually a novel about repentance, among other things, and guilt and all that, but it's not weighed down with that. What it's actually also is a satire, and specifically a satire of this kind of occultic ideal of the Antichrist to begin with. This is why my Antichrist basically is anything but an occultic, Machiavellian, conniving figure, but basically someone who's gotten roped into a job he doesn't want to take on necessarily and has to really think about and be beguiled. Literally, he's beguiled by the devil himself, who's in the guise of a cardinal. This is why the trads didn't like this book. The devil's been hiding out at the Vatican for centuries as a cardinal, and a well-respected one, and everybody knows who he is too, but they know he's also not what he used to be. So that's part of the story. So it's a combination of things: satire, Gothic horror, which I have in there as well, and also a thriller and sort of the Dan Brown / 007 thing, which keeps the pace going somewhat. And specifically, I talk about these different views of the Antichrist, because in order for the figure to be beguiled into that role, he has to come up with an alternative understanding of what being the Antichrist actually means. And actually, it's an alternative to the truth of what the Antichrist is in Scripture, and in the early church. So I even fight against the actual reality of what that term means in the New Testament. Very quickly, the only case of the word Antichrist being used is in the first and second epistles of John. And there it refers obviously to some form of early Christian false teaching, basically teaching that Jesus had not come in the flesh. That seems to be what it's referring to, a docetic understanding of who Jesus was. And that's the only thing that's called Antichrist in the entire New Testament. So there's no political connection whatsoever in that term. Mm-hmm. When you get to the book of Revelation, obviously, and also There's, the theme is there in, is it Second Thessalonians or First? I think it's Second Thessalonians.
I think it's second with the man of sin. Yeah, I mean, all these different like literary images get kind of conflated together in later consciousness, right?
And there, whatever Paul's talking about, because that's a very confusing passage, that which restrains will continue to restrain until he himself is removed or whatever, completely impossible for anybody to say 100% what he's even referring to there, if indeed Paul even wrote the second epistle to the Thessalonians. But all of that aside, the man of sin, the little horn who boasts great things, 666, all of these things probably are referring, I say probably because most scholars would lean in that direction, it's probably referring to the Roman emperor and the empire and all of that at the time. So does it have any great meaning for us in the 21st century? And the answer is pretty much a big negative. So if I were to say that I worry about the emergence of the Antichrist and the one world government, and I'm looking for all the signs of the end and all of this, absolutely not. Does it work in the novel? Yes, because there's a twist in the novel, and that's where the satirical aspect of the book is most obvious. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was my long-winded explanation.
Yeah, no, it totally does, and I feel like me at this point. I'm always down for some good old-fashioned New Testament scholarship to be thrown into conversation. Yeah, I agree with you in terms of what Paul is talking about, what the Apocalypse is talking about, are very specific to their own period. If they have any relevance for us at all, it's purely by way of like an archetype, right? Here's a name for great, boastful, immoral, idolatrous pagan emperor. I'm not going to name names, right? But whoever kind of steps into the archetype can just be that thing while they're around. But I am curious, just kind of more generally, using this as kind of a launching pad for talking about fear in general. Because even if people, I'm not afraid of the Antichrist, you're not afraid of the Antichrist, it does feel like fewer and fewer people that I know are like really conscious of that kind of dispensationalist, eschatology. But it does seem to me, just talking about fear in general, I mean, I spend a great deal of my life afraid of many things, big and small. It also seems to me that my day-to-day existence depends on the quarantining of most of my fears to some kind of manageable, background anxiety. So I can do basic things like drink coffee and drag the trash bin to the road and walk my dog. Mundane life has this like weird ability to make us ignore fear to get by, and that doesn't fix fear. It usually makes it worse in different ways. And so what's interesting about literature and fear of the sort of things that we're talking about today is that it seems to me that fears of the paranormal, the occult, the extraordinary, perhaps even the apocalyptic or the eschatological, they seem in a weird way to disrupt the mundane character of fear itself, of like the things that we are afraid of. And I think they in certain contexts, they can be welcome. Like it would be really cool to have to deal with like a vampire or wizard or something, rather than like worrying that my furnace is going to break this winter or that my dog is going to swallow something lethal by accident, right? Like it's So what use can literature offer us for dealing with fear, I guess, is kind of a first question with regard to all that.
Well, I think if you're talking about the kind of fear that is related to what we connect with, say, the literature of horror, that would be maybe one part at one end of the spectrum, the horror that we see that involves very often violence and blood and jump scare and all this sort of thing. And then the other end of the spectrum, which is a fear of maybe the uncanny. And that kind of fear is actually a different quality. If you look at fear as being something that has a range to it, you can go from the fight or flight type of fear all the way over to the very uncomfortable sense, especially when one is silent and alone. It was Edith Wharton who wrote, for example, that she experienced that kind of fear when it was silent. You know, the silent, the being alone in an atmosphere where there's nothing to disturb it, and that's when there's something that creeps in, the wariness that I think we carry around with us, just evolutionarily speaking. This constant alertness that goes all the way back to our animal prehistoric past, where we're constantly alert to things we cannot see, cannot totally grasp with our left brain, if you will, our mind. It's in those kind of contexts where those clear-cut, defined, this is why we like noise so much. You know, play something, I'll put on a rock song, I'll play something that, you know, that blocks this out. But if you give yourself to this kind of silence and solitude even, that's when the mysterious actually has the possibility of working on you. And with that comes a certain kind of fear at times. I'm not even sure if fear is the right word. It's a sense of the mysterious that, I mean, you can walk into the woods and have this sense. It's a sense of presence, but a presence that you cannot clearly define or put a name to. It's a poetic sense. Sometimes connected to melancholy or sadness. It was Edgar Allan Poe in his essay, The Poetic Principle, who unites the sense of the beautiful and the sense of sadness, that those two things, that what is beautiful also includes a certain quality of sadness. So are you there, or have I lost you?
Yeah. No, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but the picture
Okay.
stopped, and
I
wasn't sure if I lost track of you there.
Yeah, no, you froze for a second. No, that's a terrific answer. So let's dig into different parts of that actually on our way to this other thing. So you know, we had been talking about apocalyptic literature, and one of the things that I noticed in apocalyptic literature is that you know, the apocalypticist, in seeing the beautiful, right, in beholding God, or in beholding Christ, or in beholding the angel, or whatever, what is also revealed is the monstrous, right? What is also revealed is,
as you've been writing about recently.
it's the, you know, it's also the demonic. So the one that I just posted last night.
I'm losing you again.
Oh no. Let's see here.
Are you there?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet.
I can hear you now.
Awesome. I think that my internet had a hiccup, but
it's continuing to have a hiccup. So.
Oh no. Yeah.
I will wait patiently.
Okay. Perfect. You're coming through clearly now. Am I coming through?
You're coming through at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's just do what we can then.
That's right.
So yeah, I mean, you know, one of my favorite apocalyptic texts is the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, where the seer kind of descends to the underworld and he sees this horrific looking accuser, right? Who is this, you know, sort of torture master in the underworld, and this, you know, like has a record of sins, and he falls like dead at his feet. But then when he stands up, it's no longer the accuser, it's the angel Aremiel, right? Who is a judge who does have the list of the person's sins, but also the list of the person's good deeds, and is sort of the guide that, you know, allows him to progress to heaven. And so I think that that's interesting, that kind of double vision of things that you're mentioning with Edgar Allan Poe, that like the vision of the beautiful is inclusive of the vision of the sadness or the melancholy, or even kind of the evil or the monstrous.
Mhm.
So kind of to on your spectrum of horror and the uncanny, so a big part of English literature is spookier literature, dealing with otherworldly beings that either inspire horror or that inspire reflection or awe in the reader. These creatures are, of course, usually taken right out of mythology or folklore, ancient religion and magic, as well as stigma and superstition, ghosts, goblins, vampires, etc.
Mhm.
But it also seems that a big theme in this kind of literature is the rehabilitation of such creatures, or at least their humanization. So I just did a lesson with my students about golems in literature, from the Golem of Prague down through like Frankenstein's monster, or even like Vision from Marvel. Vampires have increasingly been humanized and glamorized in literature and film for the last half century. So my question would be, what in general makes for a good monster story? What are the elements that have to be there for it to be compelling? And when we tell monster stories, what are we really talking about most of the time? Like, why are we interested in the uncanny, literarily speaking?
Well, maybe the same reason. If you now, this is a distinction that, you know, you can argue with, quibble about, or whatnot. But I think it works to a point, and that is Edmund Burke's distinction between the beautiful and the sublime. If you face nature, you can see the beauty of you know, the rolling countryside with the bucolic images of, you know, sheep grazing in the pasture, and the hills, you know, far away, and all this kind of thing. And then you have like, I live in Norway, you have the sublime, and that is the rugged peaks and mountains, glaciers, you know, waterfalls that are falling hundreds of feet. And I mean, we just had 3 deaths here just a couple of days ago. People who were going to their, it's called Hitta, which it means basically their vacation cabin, and the only way over to that island was to row across. And these people have been doing this all their lives. This is where they came from. However, because of current weather conditions, the current took their boat and literally suddenly swept them down over the falls, and they found the boat, which is completely crushed. And at this point, they haven't found the 3 bodies still. Now that's the sublime, and that's a tragedy. But at the same time, here's this magnificent scenery, and it is monstrous at the same time. It's frightening. And so I think that we walk around, all of us, with a constant sense that nature is both beautiful. You know, you can, you know, we love on Facebook, you know, those memes with the kitty cat, or the wildlife, or the kind of warm stories of a cat befriending a raccoon, you know, this kind of thing. And then we go, that's nature. But on the other side of it, you've got nature red in tooth and claw and all of that, the sublime. And we are just quite naturally, not supernaturally, but quite naturally afraid of certain aspects of nature, if we have common sense, that is. And that goes right on back to our origins, you know, as a species. When we were not at the top of the food chain, we were just simply part of it. We did the best we could. We hunted what we could hunt, but we were also hunted. And so I think that this whole sense of the monstrance, that's something else, back to the traditionalists, you know. But this whole sense of the monstrous is something that we instinctively carry with us. It's not just because there are monsters, which in fact there are, but because we are still operating after just a few short thousand years of civilization. All of our makeup inside is still pretty much hunter-gatherer makeup. And so we are quite rightly afraid of that which which can harm us, which is bigger than us, which is got bigger claws than we have, or bigger fangs, or that, like this waterfall, can sweep you up and dash you to pieces without your ability to control anything anymore. You lose control. That's the monstrous. We bring that into our literature, of course. We do like we do with so many other things, we anthropomorphize it. So the bestial becomes humanized, and this is where you get the vampire imagery, for example, you know, and then you get the Frankenstein's monster, kind of a monster, and that is where our anthropomorphizing becomes the actual creation of something that reflects us, that then destroys us. Okay, so you have Frankenstein's monster. I just read an article just a few moments before we began this talk in The Guardian about the fears about AI, not the common fears, but the scientists' fears that we may actually now have stepped over the line to the point where we actually have something to be afraid of in our technocracy, which is our own creation once again. It was bad enough when we had nuclear weapons. Now we've got to worry about this new possible thing getting out of hand. So that's your monstrous. It's, you know, wherever it comes from, we know that there are forces. We like to believe that we're autonomous, that we're in control. Most of our anxieties and paranoia and everything else really is part and parcel of all of this. We're fearful, and grief is part of this too. You know, the fact that we lose people in our lives, and those are the things that we can't control, and that's where the monstrous lies. That which we cannot control, and which ultimately can hurt us or destroy us or erase us, if you will. And so I think that there's that fear. On the one hand, and that's a type of fear that we all face. And of course, when you get to the Bible and things like that, that exact same sort of mindset is right there all along. How do you describe, say, the rise of a political figure that, like an emperor? Well, you'd make him into a monster, because we understand that an emperor can be like a monster, and we all know that's true.
And that process is allegorical, but it's also more than allegory, right? Like for the ancient writer, at least, it's an allegorical thing, but because for ancient people, the animating intelligences in people groups and in empires and in political things are angelic beings, right? It's like, no, this is an actual, like, this is some kind of dark power in the world, that the best way I can depict it is as like a horrible beast, right? That's an amalgam of like everything you should be afraid of in nature. Speaking of golems and speaking of AI, the way that I ended my lesson was actually talking to them about how, you know, people are basically trying to create homunculi and or golemize humans through, you know, the whole transhumanist thing. So I just, you know, we went through all these different literary golems, and then my final one was Elon Musk. And it was just like, you know.
It even looks like, no, I shouldn't say that. Just say it looks like a homunculus, but I shouldn't say that. That's so cruel, and I'll need to go to confession or something.
No, I just meant in terms of Neuralink stuff, yeah. You know. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I like what you were saying, and I think I agree with you that the monstrous usually reflects our fears, and we have this weird capacity to fear things into existence, right? So like we get very afraid of something, and in our attempts to stave off that thing or to prevent it, we end up making it happen. right? Like we create the thing that we are afraid of. So what does AI come from, right? It comes from this fear of inconvenience, of the fear of the limitations of human abilities, from the fear of not having control over things. And what will AI ultimately do to us? It will be very inconvenient, right? It will deeply limit our ability to flourish, and it will take control from us if we're not, wise about it.
What is the subtitle of Mary Shelley's book? Isn't it The Modern Prometheus?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My wife is nodding her assent in the background.
Yeah, that's the subtitle. Now, if you take her understanding of the creature seriously, then you realize that what she's criticizing is this this hubris that we as a species possess, and it's like we can't stop ourselves from doing ourselves harm through our technology, and we've done this over and over again in the last few hundred years, last couple hundred years. The age of industrialism on up to the present has largely been a horror story. Now you ask about fears. I mean, there's your fear. We're looking at climate, we're looking at disease, we're looking at a lot of things that we can't control. There's your monsters, big time. So one of the ways that we very often psychologically deal with this is again projecting a monstrous archetype onto this, or maybe avoiding the real thing to fear by fabricating a fear that doesn't exist. How many people do you hear actually talking seriously about zombie apocalypses? I mean, there actually are people who talk seriously about that.
Yeah. And we're like obsessed with that trope, right? We keep making TV shows and movies and books where that sort of thing happens, and it's like, okay, so what are we really afraid of? I mean, we are afraid of unleashing something. I think the way I would phrase it is, we are afraid that we now have the power to do something that we can't actually fix, right? Yeah. When I have to teach on climate related things, one of the things that I try to be honest about in moderation with my students is that you are not going to be able to fix this, like it's no amount of you picking up good practices, or even like advocating and agitating and whatever, because at the end of the day, it comes down to there is a lot of wealth and power that stands behind why the world is dying right now. And until that is addressed, like, no one of us are going to fix that kind of a thing,
Right. Well, we have people who are basically in charge of, I mean, you hate to say it like this, you sound like you're in a James Bond movie or something, but you have people who are basically running the world. And we have no control over these people. Forces, national forces, international cooperative forces, NATO being perhaps an example of that, that really have our future in their hands. And God forbid that something should go wrong, because I'm not sure these people are intelligent enough to be entirely trusted. Not to say I am or you are or anything like that. I mean, but when you realize that human fallibility is sort of a besetting sin of our species in a way, that we're constantly faced with failure after failure, with a few successes in there, that it's not an encouraging scenario. It really is not.
Yeah, who needs a singular antichrist when you have a technocracy and effectively an oligarchy that I mean, and this is kind of this is the thing with conspiracy theories, right? Is that they're all bad. They're all, and like the people who fall for them are not exercising critical thought, but the instinct that like, oh, I'm probably not being told the full truth. And I
You're
probably
not.
don't, yeah,
You're
like
not.
that's correct. That's a correct instinct, right?
Right. It's every single intelligence agency. I mean, you got to remember, I mean, all the way from Project Mockingbird back in what was it, the 50s and 60s, where the CIA controlled what CBS was allowed to broadcast, and then New York Times was allowed to say. The thing we tend to forget about all intelligence agencies in the world, that every single thing they say is not just simply to give us information about themselves. It's to give us diverted intelligence about themselves. In other words, always expect disinformation to come from those sources, because that's what they do. That's their whole reason for existence, is not to tell us the truth, but to tell us what they think we should swallow. And that's not to say I'm a conspiracy theorist. It's simply to acknowledge the fact that throughout history, there's always been conspiracies. And for us to pretend that that isn't true and use the term conspiracy theorist every time somebody comes up with an idea that maybe they're not telling the truth is also naive. The conspiracy theorists, definitely we know how naive and foolish and harmful that can be. On the other hand, there are such things as conspiracies, and we don't want to be duped by that either. See, so to use critical intelligence means we don't go in either direction of belief or disbelief. We weigh everything carefully if we're going to pay attention to it at all. So
yeah, we're conspiracy Socratics, right? Socrates realized, what makes him the smartest person in the world. He knows he doesn't know anything, right?
Right.
And it's funny to watch, I mean, I have friends who are like really big into this kind of thing, and periodically when I want to listen to something wild, I just call them and listen to them talk to me. And one of the things that's fun is to just kind of watch them short circuit a bit when you ask them, like, okay, so where are you getting all this? The internet? You mean like the same internet that's controlled by all the people you're you're like really worried about? Yeah. So okay, so various kinds of monsters in the conversation at this point. One subgenre of monster literature that I know is near and dear to your heart are ghost stories. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to talk for a while about, what are the fundamental aspects of the ghost story? Who are the classic writers, in your opinion? A little bit about your forthcoming collection of them.
Yeah, I'm ready. Well, yeah, let me start with that because that's the easiest way in. I am writing a collection of ghost stories. I do not have a publisher yet because I haven't sought one, but I think that will work out. I have a couple options, and so more about that later. But yes, I write ghost stories, and I have at least, I think, about 10 or so, and I'm working on one right now. So yes, they're near and dear to my heart, for reasons. I believe in ghosts. I'll come right out and say it. I've had enough experiences. I also believe in UFOs, so I've seen one. So when you have those experiences, you might feel somewhat hesitant to tell people, but nonetheless, you have the experience. You just admit it and move on. So yes, but I don't see ghosts as monsters. I would draw a distinction there. I wouldn't lump ghosts in, say, with vampires, werewolves, things of that nature, because I think, and I also would hesitate to say what a ghost is, because I think there are so many varieties of experiences, and you can try to explain it, and it has been explained. Perhaps it's something to do with consciousness and our psychology that can be projected outward, sort of a Jungian collective unconscious sort of a thing, or perhaps because I don't believe in an immaterial, entirely immaterial presence. It's just what is, because this has an effect on the material. It seems to possess energy. So something which is preternatural or paranormal means just that. Until it's explained, it seems that way. If we could ever understand or explain, it would be normal. It would be part of nature, but we don't understand it, so we assign it supernatural, preternatural, whatever, instead of natural. All of that aside, the ghost story, I mean, the great ghost story writers, I mean, we actually have a ghost story in the Bible, for example. You have the Witch of Endor, so these go way, way back. Irving Finkel, if you know that name, he's an archaeologist in the UK. I'm trying to remember which museum. I think he's at the British Museum, actually. But he's traced ghost stories all the way back to Babylon and Egypt, and so they're a perennial part of the human narrative, if you will. And are they the spirits of the dead? Are they? Well, why not? We don't understand what. I was just reading the other day the works of Richard Methley. Methley, let's see, he would be a late 15th, early 16th century English Carthusian, and wrote books, about spiritual matters and all that. And in one of his books, he just tells about how he's being beset in his cell as a monk by what he concludes must be a demonic spirit. Okay, it seems to have evil intentions, and I liked what he had to say. He just said, because if this was a soul from purgatory asking for my prayers, he wouldn't be treating me this way, basically. So what does he assume? He just assumes that it is possible for, quote unquote, a soul from purgatory to come to his cell and implore his prayers on his behalf. And he's obviously having some kind of experience with something which he finds terribly disturbing. It sounds like poltergeist activity or something of that nature. Can we just dismiss these records that come to us down the centuries of these kinds of experiences? Well, actually, we can't, because many, many people over many, many ages, including myself and people I know quite well who are totally sane. Well, maybe excluding myself, but others who are totally sane. You can't say these encounters don't take place, because obviously for many of us they have and do. So I'm not sure where we're going with this, but I wouldn't put them in the monstrous, because I think the experience of the ghostly is of a different quality than that of the frighteningly monstrous. How I would explain that, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it, which I'll do. Obviously, the great writers of ghost stories that we're familiar with are M.R. James, E.F. Benson, Robert Aikman, Arthur Machen. You can go down the list. Edith Wharton again. In fact, a new edition has just come out of her book Ghost from New York Review of Books. And it's terrible. I'm kind of stuck in the past. So most of the names I can give you are people who are past writers. I'm sure there are many today who are writing very good ghost stories, and I just can't summon them up in my mind. But if you read those stories, I'm not talking now about Edgar Allan Poe, as much as I like Poe, which I do. His stories are definitely of a horror sort that always involve a very troubling psychological condition almost. But the classic ghost story, to use Poe's connection of beauty with sadness, I would say the classic ghost story always involves an element of sadness to it. I can't remember the name of the story, but there was one that's written by Rudyard Kipling about the ghosts of children. And it's very affective. He actually wrote it after the death of his own child. And I would say that's of the essence of the ghost story. It's not a fear of the monstrous. It's a fear of running into somebody or something that evokes a sense of something lost, something that has passed. It is connected somehow to the whole sense of impermanence. The idea of time like a river bears all her sons away, something wistful, something that you can just barely put your finger on. It has something of the nostalgic, definitely something of the melancholy, and in many good ghost stories, something that transforms the one who encounters the spirit so that they are changed significantly by that encounter, maybe positively, or sometimes, especially think of M.R. James with all his professors, left-brained again, kind of professor types who encounter these, they're usually very often they're antiquaries who are reading an old text, and then suddenly they come face to face with the very thing that is repellent and frightening and everything, and it's very, very quick. But somehow it challenges them to rethink their entire world view. Everything has altered because of this experience with the uncanny, the unexpected, the unfamiliar, the unknown. And that, I think, is what the ghost story is. And I think that's a different take than on the monstrous, because the monster is something that is out to get you. The ghost is someone who tends to remind us of something.
Yeah, to that point, when I listed them under the category of the monstrous, the thinker that I was depending on there was John Michael Greer, who's a contemporary occultist, and he has a book on monsters where he defines the monstrous literally through the Latin as monstrum, right? It shows something, it's an epiphany.
Yeah, it reveals something. Yes, okay.
Yeah. So I agree with you that ghosts. I mean, there can be ghosts who fall into that second monstrous category, right? Like the hungry ghost that gives us our vampire or our zombie or the revenant or whatever, right?
Right.
But I agree with you that I think either ghosts don't belong in the category of the monsters if we restrict it to the violent or the threatening. But if we open it up, then it's purely in that epiphanic sense that you're talking about of
right. Again, it's like I think I see it as on a range. I mean, all the way from the most horrible, bloodletting kind of fear to the uneasiness we have with that which is uncanny, that which is from the past, but is making itself felt to us in a way that is unnerving. It's something present, but it's something present that shouldn't be here. It should be in a different time. And again, a reminder of impermanence. I think that's very essential in this case. Things pass away, but they don't quite pass away, so
yeah,
that's an intangible thought.
Well, and actually, my favorite ghost story, and I figured you'd appreciate this, comes from Thailand. It's the story of Mai Nak, who is she's sort of a hungry ghost character. She gets married and then she dies like very early, like on her wedding night or something. But she's so desirous, she's so attached through craving to being wife to her husband, that her ghost just like keeps going, right? And she doesn't realize that she's dead. And then she begins to get very upset when she can't have children, and she begins to, she begins to kind of get murderous. So Samdet Do, the like famous magical monk from Thai Buddhism, ends up being the one who sort of uses magic to appease her, lock her away, however you want to put it. And this hungry ghost story ends up becoming, I mean, it's actually like an essential part of Thai Buddhism, right? So Justin McDaniel is the one who wrote like a whole book about this. And it's really interesting how there's something, even in that horror story, effectively, there, to your point, there's something about transience that's being revealed, right? There's something about the transience of like the things that we are attached to, and how becoming overly attached to them can turn us into hungry ghosts, right? Who are just trying to like cling to life and suck it out of whatever we can get it from.
Yeah. I think when you turn, say, to Japanese and to Thailand and places like that, those ghost stories, there you are getting much closer at times, at any rate, to the monstrous in that other way of speaking. And the certainly you see this in many of the Japanese, because their idea of ghosts can be quite different. Although, if you remember, in cases after natural disasters like Fukushima, and the the events that took place later in where was my mind is drawing about the tsunami of 2004, and this was in
It's in the South, isn't it?
Right. It's not Japan, obviously. It's way down towards the south. Anyway, in Southeast Asia, where that occurred, you have incredibly interesting stories, supposedly true accounts of those who had died in that being seen afterwards by various people, cab drivers who are picking up people who disappear in the back seat. And those are very, very similar in many respects to ghost stories we're all familiar with in the West. It's similar themes, a sense of loss and remembrance of those who have disappeared, and here they are, and then they disappear, and it leaves you with that sense of longing that those who were with us are no more, so again, that sense of impermanence, which again, if you're in the Buddhist tradition, that's absolutely central to what you believe anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is all great. To your point about diversity of ghosts, I mean, in Greek antiquity, there are something like 8 different kinds of ghosts who are specifically ghosts that attack like women and children, right? There's like the Strix, there's the Lamia, there's the, et cetera, et cetera. There are ghosts that are connected to places, there are ghosts that are connected to things, there are ghosts that are attached to specific kinds of experiences. I mean, I agree with you that it's really difficult to try and taxonomize what ghosts are or the experience of them, because cultures that have historically taken them very seriously they're not a singular thing. We're stuck with this one English word, right?
Right.
Ghost.
Basically, it's gust of wind. Spirit is the same thing, and but you're right. There should be. Well, we have a few. I mean, poltergeist. Actually, Luther was the one who invented that word. But you do have different sorts of spirit, and as we should know from our tradition, Christian tradition at any rate, there are many varieties of spirits, if you want to use that and I think just about every major spiritual tradition in the world sees it that way. There's a multitude of spirits, from what we consider the angelic all the way to the spirits, again, like Methley's soul from purgatory, who's, please pray for me kind of a thing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there's a whole cosmos, right? Like you can't get into ghosts without thinking about sort of the whole of the spiritual world. So I guess actually that's kind of an interesting segue. I mean, like one ancient connection, at least for the Greeks, with ghosts is the goes, the sorcerer, right? Who is actually someone who can use the goos, the funerary dirge, to like summon and control the ghost or earn favors from it or magically prescribe it. You mentioned earlier the Witch of Endor. Not all magic is about ghosts, but popularly we kind of conflate the ghostly and the occult, right? I mean, it's Halloween time, right? It's spooky month. Like we sort of, at least in American culture, we like throw all this stuff together as like, yep, this is the same kind of thing. And it all goes with this season where things are getting cold and the day is getting shorter. Is there a real relationship there between the ghosts and the occult, to your mind? If not, how did we get this connection? Talk about that a bit.
Now, are you talking about, when you say the occult, what are we talking about exactly? How would you go about defining the occult? Because it's a tricky word. It's more slippery than one might think. Actually.
Yeah, I think similarly to how, there's a spectrum in literature between horror and the uncanny. I think the occult can apply to everything from a kind of generalized esotericism in most traditions, right? Like arguably, in Judaism, for example, Kabbalah is arguably occult insofar as it's esoteric, it's hidden, right? Like Latin occultus.
Right.
Yeah, it's hidden. It's not available to everybody. You could arguably say the same thing about a decent amount of like Christian mystical theology or practice, right? And then I would like that sort of ranges into what we kind of popularly call magic, which of course, like anyone who's been through a religious studies class knows that magic is like sometimes helpful and sometimes a really useless term, because it basically just means religion that like you don't like, right? So
it's
yeah.
So
that's kind of, I realize it's like a broad definition, but just like is our popular kind of conflation of like the ghostly and the occult, is that appropriate? Is there a real relationship there? I mean, I know a lot of the people in the late 19th and early 20th century who are interested in ghosts are also interested in different kinds of occult type things and different kind of streams of esotericism.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, the two things are connected, just historically, if nothing else. And I think the 19th century and the early 20th would be the height of this fascination with the occult, with the magical. Interestingly, Evelyn Underhill, in her 1911 classic Mysticism, which, if you haven't read, is well worth the read. In one of her earlier chapters, shows that she pictures mysticism and magic as being at the polar opposites of one another, which is a fascinating contrast. So for her, magic and the occult is at one end of the pole, but at the far other end is classical mysticism of the Christian, Jewish, Islamic slash, although she doesn't write about it, but would also be Buddhist and etc. Vedantic, this kind of thing. She had been a practicing member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, incidentally, for a while, like Charles Williams had, whose books of his Christian novels, not my favorite novels, I have to admit, mainly because I can't appreciate his prose, but interesting man. He was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, and he his Christian books are fascinating because he also seems to espouse what can only be called a Christian form of occultism. In fact, he was practicing these things all the way through his life until he died in his 40s sometime. So, people talk about he left magic and became a Christian, quote unquote. In fact, he was practicing both side by side, all his life. So there's an interesting overlap there. Where am I going with this anyway? I'm trying to think through now.
Well, but before you get to the connection with the ghostly, I would also list Valentin Tomberg on that list of people with his, I periodically, when I have the energy for it, I try to progress through at least one more arcanum of the meditations on the tarot, and it's an interesting book. What I think is most fascinating to me about it is just how sort of natural he feels as both a Catholic and a Hermeticist, effectively.
Yeah, well, that's not.
Yeah.
Was it? It was Max Beerbohm who wrote a very funny story, which I cannot remember the name of, but he one of his characters is a Catholic diabolist. I can't think of the name. Oh, I have to find that. It's hilarious. Anyway, yeah, sorry, I just got sidetracked there.
No, you're good.
Max Beerbohm always sidetracks me. His ghost is here somewhere floating about, I believe.
Yeah. No, but there's definitely something about like that kind of Anglo-Catholic tradition in 19th and 20th century England and interest in, esotericism, magic, ghosts, right?
Spiritualism, the rise of spiritualism in the 19th century. Well, actually, the interest in that sort of thing is as early as John Wesley, who was very fascinated by ghostly phenomenon. He had grown up in a house with a poltergeist and all that, and he would go on his preaching expeditions and then get sidetracked by a story of a poltergeist or ghost, and definitely want to go see the local ghost haunted house. So when you think of Methodism, remember here's a man, talk about someone interested in ghosts and all that. It was the Wesley brothers. Anyway, the occult. What do we do with the occult? Because the occult, by the way, in my novel, Aleister Crowley appears in one part.
Brilliant.
Not literally. He's just they according to the story, they were able to take his body before he was cremated, and they have him stuffed in a museum. So anyway, if you haven't gotten to that part, you'll enjoy the Aleister Crowley part.
Yeah,
I hope. Anyway, no, I think the thing is that the occult, once again, is an attempt very often. Now, if you're thinking of Crowley and the kind of occultism where you summon up and try to control the spirits, there you're trying, and this is where Evelyn Underhill makes her point. Mysticism is an openness to mystery and an abandonment of self, or trying to leave the ego behind and enter into a relationship with the great mystery. Magic is trying to control that mystery, trying to control spirit and forces that it thinks it knows. Very often occultism, you got all these names of various demons and angels and these incantations and rites that the problem with that is of course that I can just, in fact, again, to refer to my novel, I mean, I can just picture the quote unquote devil laughing at this. I mean, it's so absurd, that these little primates down here are trying to control those things which are far more powerful and more dangerous than they're aware. But if you're willing, I'll play along. Is sort of the attitude, I think. I think occultism, by and large, is a combination, usually, of wishful thinking, delusion, and an actual spiritual activity, but which is doing things on a level that's destructive of the people who are ultimately practicing it. And this is why you can look at the stories of great occultists, and almost every one ends up being a tragedy of some sort.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at how their lives end up, it becomes tragic. Who was it? Anger. What was his first name? Kenneth Anger.
Perhaps, yeah.
A filmmaker who was very involved. He made a film about this kind of. I'm trying to remember now. He was a producer in Hollywood. Got very involved with Crowley and his, esotericism. After Crowley was dead, of course. I think he got mixed up with Jimmy Page and all of that at the time. But then you read about his life story, and I mean, it's just absolutely tragic. Really, it was a self-destructive life, because it's always mixed in with the unleashing. I mean, you think of what's at the very center of say, and this wouldn't characterize all the occult, but certainly it does. The brand that Crowley was involved with was, basically that to do what you will is the whole of the law. That somehow the unleashing of your own passions and some of their rites could be quite orgiastic. I mean, that sounds like some kind of fundamentalist Christian exaggeration, but we know for a fact that was what was going on in many cases. That's just on the record. So of course you're going to end up involved in strange sexual experiences, the possible death of some people, if not the intentional death of some people, addictions of various sorts, all of it, and it converges and becomes a destructive thing. So I would say, one should just steer away from the occult because it's not mentally hygienic, if nothing else.
Yeah, you mentioned Jung earlier, and I think one conclusion you can draw from Jung's thought is that there are sort of two ways to get over the ego, right? There's one way where you stop identifying the self with the ego and you simply use the ego as a rudder for the archetypes, right? So do I need to identify with this particular archetype or this particular, in another set of words, we could say, like, do I need to let this spirit in right now, right? Like this spirit of anger or the spirit of joy or whatever. There's another way, though, that the ego can sort of be overwhelmed, and I think that's through sort of total identification of the self with it, as well as total identification of the ego with these realities that you're talking about that the occultist seeks to commune with. And that is its own kind of danger, right? Like the question, like there's one set of questions that's like, okay, are there demons, right? And then there's another set of questions that are like, okay, well, regardless of whether or not there are demons, what can we say about like the demon possessed, right? Like either today or in the Gospels. And it seems that there is some, there's some sense in which psychology definitely intersects with the whole question of possession, or the whole question of kind of what, to your point about mental hygiene, like what is deteriorating in the psyche through identification with the darker forces. Yeah. And also I was going to say, I mentioned John Michael Greer earlier. Greer, to your point kind of about like, the difference between mysticism and magic. I mean, Greer makes a point in one of his talks on magical practice that people who go into magical practice looking for what he calls fantasy magic, right? Like the ability to, I don't know, shoot fire out of your hands or something. are going into magic for the wrong thing. He says magic is about like expanding the consciousness and interacting with the mystery. And I have a note in my Kindle like on that passage in him, like, well, then why go to magic for that? Right.
Yeah, if I would, going back to like we spoke about in the last interview you had with me, I mean, I would direct him to, basically to mouthwash his mind with practice Zen or Chan or something, which is going to eradicate an awful lot of this delusional thinking right away. Because the first thing you do there is you attack it. I've got a system, or I've got magical incantations. I got all these things. What does the Zen mentality do? It dismantles all that. It takes a wrecking ball to all of these kinds of playthings that we create for ourselves, which we think are doing us spiritual good, but in reality are a waste of time and a sidetrack from actually focusing on the realities, which in a sense comes back to sort of the Jungian thing. If for Jung, the archetypes are very real. They're also part of us, but they're almost self-existent within us. There are other selves that, as we begin to, I would say, if you're going to practice meditation of any sort, you're going to run into them. They're going to be there. They may not be as starkly personified as Philemon was for Jung himself in his red book and all that. But you're going to encounter this within yourself, because all these things exist within yourself. In a sense, like they say, all the gods, all the ghosts, everything is within you anyway. So the hungry ghosts are there, and I would say in a Christian idiom, we were so afraid. Some people are so afraid of being, I'm going to be demon possessed, and yes, you could be. I don't doubt that, but there's also you're going to discover that what you consider the demonic is also lurking there inside. This is the darkness and the shadow and the that area of the unconscious, which we repress, which is we don't want to see. But in meditation, in spiritual practice, in the solitude and silence that Edith Wharton said she had where her fears emerged, that is part of the meditative mystical life, to engage that, not to be afraid of it, but to be aware that it's going to be evoked. And maybe that's why we turn as much as we can to distractions, to noise, to anything to not see and deal with those areas of our life. So anyway,
and in fairness, on a day-to-day basis, it's not practical, right? Like on a day-to-day basis, I mean, look, and I think this often as someone who like you, believes in all this stuff and is open to all of it, right? And doesn't make prejudicial judgments about what I think reality can be. And yet at the same time, it's like, look, my life is fairly simple and ordinary in most ways, right? Like I get up, I go to work, I do the same kinds of things everybody else does. I hang out with my family. Like, I'm not on a daily basis encountering gods and ghouls and and what have you, right? That doesn't mean that I don't think they're real. And I think there are two reductionisms here. I think one reductionism is the one that, we popularly preach against, the reductionism that would say, oh, well, it's all just a projection of something that's inside of you, right? Like, God is just your super ego, or the devil is just your id, or whatever. But then there's another kind of reductionism, which would say that, no, these are purely exterior beings, right? These are purely discrete entities that exist outside of us, and they're not reflections at all of us. I mean, that sort of defeats the microcosm, right? Yeah. Because at the end of the day, there is a real psychological question separate from the question of, does any of this exist? Is any of it real? Like, are we all wasting our time? There's the psychological question of what's the connection to me here? Like, what is this showing me about myself? Why am I interested in this? Right.
Yeah.
And you know, like to your point earlier about ghostly apparitions, there's one kind of set of scientific like questions, right? About like, well, what was that? And like, you know, can I see it again? Can I classify it? Can I organize all of this data and come up with some kind of account of it? But then there's another question of like, what does that do to me? Right. What is so?
Yeah, it's interesting when you pick up on this term microcosm. It's important to remember that we are microcosms of the whole. That, you know, this is where understanding that we are, in a sense, you know, the universe reflecting on itself, you know, to use what has almost become a cliche, but it's absolutely the case. We're on the one hand, we are individual, but we're not individuals in the sense of being separate from the whole. We are, it's like the Trinity, you know, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, all three one God, and yet they're distinct but not separated or differentiated in any ontological sense. And all of us, in a sense, are the same way with the whole that we are part of. We are microcosms. So it shouldn't be that surprising that when the question comes up, is, say, something ghostly or archetypal or whatever, if it makes its appearance to us, is that psychological or is it outside of us? You know, are we looking at it or is it looking at us? And the answer to both, you know, to that question really is yes. That, you know, I don't think we see ourselves, in a sense, you know, if I can use this kind of, we don't see ourselves as God sees us. Okay, you know, and I believe very sincerely that we live, move, have our being in what we call God, or the Tao, if you want to use impersonal language. And we're in it, it's in us, he's in us. And the way that reality is that we live in relation to everything else. You know, we're constantly in a position of relationship to the whole. So is it merely a matter that we have projected some kind of ghostly thing on the outside and that this is all somehow delusional or an illusion, a hallucination or whatever, or is it real? And I would say it's not entirely a projection from us. It's not entirely disconnected from us in any deep psychological sense. There is certainly something going on there that is imperceptible to us on a rational level, but is real on a spiritual level that we simply, this side of death, do not have a direct understanding of. I'm a believer that on the other side of death, we wake up and we will see things as they are, or begin to see things as they are. And I think that will be vastly different than what we think this perceptible reality is at the present time in this life that we live in the mundane world, as you say, walking the dog and everything else.
Yeah,
and that's a lot of verbiage. There is actually a meaning there, but I can't express it any better than that, I'm afraid.
no, I fully agree. I fully agree with everything you're saying. And I think it, you know, there's something to that about the relativity with which things appear, right? Like the relational basis on which we perceive things and understand things. In Jainism, of course, there's the principle of like, you know, complexity, or of what is sometimes translated as skepticism, from Prakrit. The word's escaping me at the moment, but it's like one of the fundamental principles alongside ahimsa for Jains is this idea that knowledge is fundamentally relative, right? Like an epistemology of where you are standing. And that's sort of what's, in that tradition, that's what's significant about Mahavira's omniscience that he acquires as a Kevlin, right? Is that the ability to kind of know everything requires a fundamental empathy for every entity in the universe, right? Like an ability to see alongside them effectively.
Right, right. Yeah, it's funny, just to bring this down to the practical level. I would say for someone, I mean, especially someone who takes something like ahimsa, for example, seriously. I mean, I can't bring myself to kill a wasp if it's in. Now, years ago, I would have had no hesitation. Okay, a wasp, a fly, whatever. I find myself picking up the wasp with a piece of Kleenex or something and putting it outside. I can't bring myself to do that any longer, and I would have to chalk that up to my meditative practice over the years, making it virtually impossible for me, in a sense, not to sort of. I know this sounds terribly. Believe me, I'm a grouch and everything else, and some people will tell you I'm a total son of a bitch and everything. But that aside, the realities of my grumpiness towards my fellow man and woman, despite all that, it's increasingly difficult for me not to see, in a sense, with the eyes of the wasp. I have this kind of sympathy for that creature because I can sort of identify with that. And I say that right now because we have wasps who, for some reason, have decided to come in through a vent in our house, and we're trying to block that up. And I'm picking them up and putting them out every day during the autumn weather as it comes in. But I don't know where I'm going with that. But I think that is something that does come with, say, practicing a spiritual discipline. That instead of, this is one of the problems with occultism, when you want to use the spirit or use nature for your own ends and do it, say, magically or whatever, which is no different. It's just simply another. I mean, all technology is the same thing. We're going to dominate the earth with our fuels and our presence and our industry and all this. All that is just a form of the same magical thinking that we're in control. We're going to dominate nature. Whereas I think a healthy mystical practice, or healthy, I don't even really like the word mysticism, but a healthy spiritual practice is not going to go in that direction. The last thing in the world you'd ever do is sacrifice an animal to invoke a spirit or something of that nature. More and more, you're going to want to preserve the life of other creatures as well as your own and other human beings, and to see yourself as part of the whole. And I think that any healthy spiritual discipline leads you in that direction. I think that's what Evelyn Underhill was moving towards in her statement in her book Mysticism.
Yeah, to your point, inclusive of the spiritual world, right? So, I mean, in my case, I mean, I see ahimsa both as like a lifelong spiritual goal for me, as well as a self-castigation, like a source of self-reproach, because like many Americans who grew up kind of in a lower socioeconomic class, like I have a lifetime of enculturation of associating being full or being well nourished with like having meat, right? And so that's something that I have a goal of becoming a vegetarian that's sort of faces different mental and practical obstacles in my life. But also with the spiritual world, I think that there comes a point where you have to cultivate an inner detachment, even from the real enmity or the real malice that can exist in the spiritual world. I think of that, one of the images of that for me is Athenodorus, the Stoic philosopher from Pliny's 82nd epistle, right? He buys the haunted house, the ghost comes to him, and Athenodorus is just like, wait a second, right? I'm busy. and then I'll be with you in a second.
Yeah.
But also the Desert Fathers. I mean, the way the Desert Fathers react to the demons, right? Like the demons come to them and they just like chat. They're just like, like Satan comes to Macarius. I think I mentioned this one to you last time, right? He comes down to Macarius and he says, Macarius, I'm just like you in every way but one. And Macarius is like, oh, cool, what's that? Right? Like he's just like, yeah, tell me about it. Like, what's up, Satan? So there's a kind of receptivity, which doesn't need to be necessarily hospitality to the whole spiritual world, but it is a kind of awareness that every spiritual being in the cosmos is also, right, finite and conditioned, and maybe some of them are experiencing bliss, but like many of them are just as locked in samsara as you and I are, right?
Right. Well, you remember, I mean, this is again talking about cliches, but most of us who are into these matters, we're all fairly familiar with Saint Isaac of Syria and his beautiful statement that a man of God, a spiritual person, in other words, will not only have sympathy for other human beings, but also for the animals, and he lists them, and even the reptiles, and will even pray for the demons. That his sympathy goes to that level. And of course, you get certain attitudes about these things from certain kinds of believers, and that's almost incomprehensible. But what that really says is that whereas it's incomprehensible to a certain kind of believer, it is not just comprehensible, but comprehensive in the area of mercy and love, that these things are created beings. And yes, they may have all kinds of malicious, evil intent, whatever, but they're not beyond the concern or the sympathy of the person who has had some kind of awareness of spirit and of God. I just find Isaac quite moving.
Yeah, well, he continues to be one of the best evidences that the Church of the East is simply the best of us, I think.
In those areas, definitely, certainly.
Yeah. Well, so
architecture, but
yeah, well, I mean, what I think they did well was they enculturated everywhere they went, right? And they enculturated not just by way of learning language and whatever, but they also learned the fundamental religious culture and idiom of the various people groups they found themselves among, and they found ways of expressing Christianity in that language. And it probably has something to do with the extreme diversity of kind of the Silk Roads region in general, right? And of the different missionary religions that were passing along it. But I mean, it says something, right? That there was like one Nestorian diocese at some point that hosted, like, one bishop oversaw both Christian and Manichaean communities, and like nobody saw a problem with it, right? It's
get that the Church of the East, for example, you have a lot of stories of that. They somehow they were able to bury their differences and just learn to coexist.
Or the monks in China who, when Buddhism came to China and the Nestorians were sort of already there, they had trouble initially translating their Sanskrit sutras into Chinese, and the monks of the Church of the East were like, oh, hey, like, we know Chinese and we know Sanskrit. Let us help you,
Well, they asked the Christian monks in Tibet to come and help them do this kind of translation, and those are the wonderful stories that unfortunately, in our sort of erasure of that branch of Christianity, in a way, we lost an awful lot of, I think, absolutely what Christianity could have become more of, or should have been more inclusive of, I guess.
Yeah. Well, so that's a cheerful ghost of Christian past, and to kind of, I guess, unify various of these streams. I mean, I think you remarked either to me in a personal message or maybe somewhere on Facebook that, October, November, and December are all ghost months, at least literarily speaking. So maybe kind of like looking beyond October, looking beyond the kind of, I suppose I would ask, how do we today cultivate a stronger culture around ghost stories in these seasons? I mean, historically we had one, right? Like telling ghost stories at Christmas was a favorite pastime. I feel like that's kind of fallen out of practice. Like, what do we need to do? How do we have a ghostly fall and winter?
Well, I can only say what I do. I mean, this is the time of year. It starts getting darker now, and in Norway, as you know, it gets very dark by December. You're talking 4 hours of daylight where I am, and even less if you go north to the point where there is no daylight for a vast amount of time. Unlike many people, I love this time of year. I can write more and read more, and I would say that no matter where you are, if this is your experience of October, November, December into January, I mean, you can't go wrong. If you want to cultivate that more, is just simply reading ghost stories, and there are numerous collections that can introduce people to some of the very best writers, and then from there you just branch off and start picking up collections of each writer's work. I mentioned a new edition of Edith Wharton's ghost stories earlier, but there are certainly many others that can be found. I would say a great one because of the connection with nature and the uncanny. Arthur Machen is one to definitely discover. M.R. James, of course, is sort of the father of the ghost story. If you're looking for a good collection, look for M.R. James, and he's famous for his ghost stories he told every Christmas Eve. They'd have their midnight mass is about to come or whatever, and the collection of students, and he would tell one of his stories in that context. If you look online on YouTube, you can find a number of them that have been dramatized. So if you don't want to read, you can certainly start looking for, say, M.R. James Ghost Story for Christmas. There's a lot of wonderful videos of Christopher Lee reading as if he is, because he knew M.R. James. I don't think there was anybody on the planet that actually he had never known Christopher Lee, but he apparently knew James just like he had known many others. He was the cousin of Ian Fleming, for example. But you could find him reading or telling these ghost stories online, and he has that wonderful sonorous voice, and he just tells the story. So how do you go about bringing this in? If you're looking for good ghost stories, they're there, and right now they're very popular. But I'd say, any revival of that aspect of Christmas and the months leading up to that, along with fantasy in general. I mean, heaven's sakes, go back and read read Mallory too. I mean, go back and read your medieval folks and Shakespeare and things like that. But for the ghost story, it's the perfect time of year to enjoy that. Make a fire in the fireplace and ruin the atmosphere outside.
And short of reading, or in addition to reading, right? Watch your Muppets. Now that the Muppets have additionally a Halloween canon.
Oh, do they? Yes, I guess they do.
Muppets Haunted Mansion is worth your time if you're a Muppet fan. I'll just throw that out there.
Oh, I was Muppets before you were born.
Yeah. Listen, I am just preaching the good news of the Muppets all the time to anyone who will listen. I think what I enjoy most about them as I've gotten older is that they are sort of the last franchise I can think of that is created for children, but with like adult intelligence in the humor, I guess.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um,
It was actually the humor's much of it's for the adults, and the kids get to listen in and think it's for them. So
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
I tell you, connected to Jim Henson, and you've probably seen him, but his series, The Storyteller, was
I've seen a
superb.
couple of them. Yeah.
Yeah, you go back. I think it was the '80s or the early '90s. I think it was in that period. But the last I looked, they were on Amazon Prime, and there's another collection that is that's Greek myths. But the best ones, in my opinion, were the fairy tales. And basically, that's what a ghost story is. If you really want to know what I'm writing right now, my own ghost stories, they would be modern fairy tales as much as anything else. All the best features of a good fairy tale, and I'm talking now the great ones, Grimm, up through Anderson and all that. But the medieval fairy tale in our own time would be also what you would find in classical ghost story writing, and it's an unbroken tradition. But the beauty of the Jim Henson thing was there's humor in them. It's not like the Muppets, but the weirdness, the absolute sort of hair-raising aspects of the old fairy tales comes through pretty well, as much as you could do it on television for kids
Yeah.
in those days.
Well, I mean, he was a singular genius
Oh,
is the real heart of that, right? I mean, I mean, I've been a lifelong fan of the Dark Crystal and the Muppets, and really just anything I've ever found by him. The Emmett Otter's Christmas Jug Band or whatever it's called
yeah,
is
right,
like
right.
it's like a classic,
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I do think that resurrecting something of a culture around ghost stories and around interesting ghosts is important. I think like one thing that I've experienced so far this year is I find it a little bit more difficult to get into the season this year. And I'm wondering if that's because I'm just generally tired, or I'm wondering if kind of wrapping around to earlier, like the beginning of our conversation, I'm wondering if it's just that the state of the world is so scary that, who needs who
Yeah,
needs ghosts
you don't
right
need ghosts to be scared. In fact, that's a good point. I think about. I mean, in fact, the ghost story I'm reading now is about a World War II veteran, and he's actually seen real horror. So the ghostly aspect doesn't hold a whole lot of fear for him. It's he's seen things far worse than a specter or two. Um, but yeah, the state of the world today, that is for me much more legitimately scary, because what I see happening is a reduction of what makes us human, and I see it happening so quickly that it's quite unnerving. We're rapidly becoming a surveillance culture, for example, and things like this, that if it goes to the full extent, will create an anthill human community, which isn't worth living in, quite frankly. There's no point. And we just blithely go along with this. And that to me is a much more frightening prospect for the future than the traditional like frightening. That to me is far more monstrous and far more horrifying.
now? Yeah. It is, I think, I continue to maintain that the value of I mean, this is what I talked to David about a couple of times on this interview thing. Is that I continue to think the value of like apocalyptic messianism is definitely that we're to a point where like none of the things that are threatening the human future and human flourishing are like really within the kind of progressive collective ability to control at this point, right? There's I have this debate with a friend of mine often who's like a very progressive Jewish thinker, and like when we talk about messianism, he's like, I really like the idea of messianism as like a collective force in the world moving towards good. And it's like, look, I'm on board with that. I'm not against it. I just don't see it. I don't see it fixing everything, right? I don't see it tearing down the system. I see it very easily becoming complicit with the system at any particular point in the name of like future progress, right?
Well, yes, exactly, which is really the point of this thing. That's really what's at the heart of that, and so it's a good point actually to be making, that he's making with you. It's very easy to foresee this as being, this is what's going to turn the world around, a sort of messianism, and again, in my own novel, there's a different conclusion entirely, but it's basically walking away from that possibility that there's a whole different there's a misunderstanding of the Messiah, if you will, and we just didn't catch on, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, Addison, that seems like a really good place to kind of wrap up for today. I had a blast doing this, and as always, I hope you'll agree to do it again at some point.
Anytime, sure. Just next time you should have an addition to the family. So
yes. So that's also maybe a good place to announce that these will probably go on pause for at least the next month or so. But yeah.
To you and your wife, and I hope all goes well.
Thank you. Yes, we are very excited, and her due date is actually November the 5th, which, to our point about tearing down the system, makes me just hope, that this designates her, female messiah who will tear down the.
Well, for the sake of our children and grandchildren, we need to hope for a new direction for everyone.
Absolutely. Addison, it's always good to see you.
Good to see you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.